The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, in which I, one of your hosts, Tylor, knows these books and tries to guide you through them. And I am joined, of course, by Greg, my co-host, who is being guided, but somehow seems to know just as much as I do on most weeks. Greg, how are things?
I'm good. I don't know how much I know this week. We are in a very timey-wimey, we talked last night, but also in the future type moment. So who knows what will happen as this conversation unfolds. But as always, I'm very excited to be here talking about books. We are closing out summer as this goes live. And, you know, there's nothing better than at the end of summer kind of cramming in as much free time reading as you can before work takes back over. Spoken like the spoiled academics we are, but my wife, who does not have an academic job, hates. She's like, yeah, you know how you're sad you're going back to work? That's me all summer, all the time. So I try to be sensitive, but also I'm trying to read as much as I can. So it was a pleasure to have 3 chapters this week to discuss for this book, and my notebook fell closed. So let's see if I can get the titles. We have Chapter 18, Healing, Chapter 19, Awakening, and Chapter 20, Visitations, all, of course, from Book 3, The Dragon Reborn. Now, before I throw to you for your first synopsis, we should remind people that on Fridays in the month of August, we have been doing a recap series on the Wheel of Time television show season 1. And that wraps up 2 sweet little days from now with episode 4, which covers episodes 7 and 8.
Yep.
This, like, years of Star Wars fandom has prepared me for this cross episode numbering thing. And so we hope people have joined us on that journey. If not, steal a free month of Prime, ask the internet for a password to borrow, DM Tylor directly, maybe, and enjoy some Wheel of Time, and then listen to us yammer on about it. The episode dropping in 2 days has a first for our podcast: a woman, which, thank God, we finally got somebody who's not a dude bro to talk to us about.
I thought you were going to say first for our podcast, the reveal of one of our social media accounts' passwords. You have 2 more days to change that before that goes live, because I'm not editing it.
I totally forgot about that.
I think that we are at this point kind of in a really exciting point for the podcast, because we are kind of getting to branch out a little bit. We're getting into the part of the books that I get really excited about. And so to some degree, I guess what I'm saying is, let's take the momentum from that fun podcast episode we just did 2 days ago about the television show and direct all of that energy at 3 really remarkably short chapters, but still, I think, pretty interesting. And we will begin today with Chapter 18, Healing, the shortest of our 3 very short chapters. So in Healing, Egwene is led into the basement of the tower. She is told that this is where they keep some of the most powerful artifacts, and this is where the Black Aja originally tried to break into. She is basically told not to think about the Black Aja at all by Sheriam. And then we learn that there are several Aes Sedai who will be participating in the healing. Some of them are names that we've recognized. Varen and Siwan and Lyanna are all there. But we also get a few new names, including Seraphel and Alana, which, if you've been watching the show, Alana is a character that you may know pretty well. We then get to actually see the process of the healing. The Merlin takes out a white wand that she says is the most powerful sangreal that they have. in the tower. She then says that she will direct the flows, and it seems as if all of the women are contributing power to one thing that the Merlin is doing rather than them each doing something individually. As they are doing this, both Nynaeve and Egwene comment on how much power is being channeled and kind of the temptation to want to channel that much. At this point, Mat starts screaming and then starts screaming in another language. Eventually, the dagger is separated from him. He quiets. And then when someone asks, what was Mat screaming about? They basically say, oh, he was giving orders to soldiers in a 2,000-year-old battle. And that is the entirety of the chapter healing. So normally I go on for 3 or 4 times that long before you get a chance to talk, Greg. What were your thoughts on this chapter? I think interesting, a few little hints here and there, but kind of so brief, I was surprised it wasn't combined with the following chapter.
I didn't listen to any of that. I was changing our password. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a theme for the night is, it almost feels like on one of these prestige television shows where you're like, you really needed to make a 2-hour movie and you made a 10 episode miniseries.
Yeah.
And so it does feel like kind of all these things are really spread out. By far the most compelling part, I thought, is the presence of the old blood to kind of summarize all those different things that kind of brought Mat out of character and gave us an idea that something else is going on here. So that was really interesting, and is particularly how that gets expanded upon in the next 2 chapters as well. Still trying to maintain the separate aspects of this. So, we said last week, and I think the week before actually, that it felt like this is just making sure we catch up with these characters to the events of the last book. And this is still kind of handling the fallout. But I think then the turn becomes, let's start to set up something new for this character, Mat, who's, I'm not here to say the issue of the dagger is forever settled, but essentially that plot line seems closed and we have a new plot line opening up.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the way to think of this. It's very much a transition kind of set of chapters where we almost go from a world in which Mat is a very minor character to one in which he seems to be one of the main players very, very quickly. In my mind, there are kind of 2 big things in this chapter that I want to highlight. You've already kind of talked about one of them, right? I think that this idea of the old blood, of Mat speaking kind of in an ancient dead tongue. And then interestingly, I think the fact that it is kind of military speak that is what we get referenced here. I find that to be especially interesting, given that Mat, I think of all 5 of the 2 Rivers characters is the one who has been least fleshed out at this point. And so that I think is a turn I really didn't expect. So we're kind of taking this chapter a little bit backwards, starting at the end. But what was your kind of, what stood out to you about that kind of Mat and the old blood section? You said that was the piece that you enjoyed. Were there any particular moments, or I guess what attracted you to that, as opposed to, for me, I actually found myself more interested in the Aes Sedai side of the chapter. So you talk about the Mat stuff, and then I can get into the White Tower politics later.
I just like blood, and no, I think, and I'm being careful here. So, the way they position his character as seemingly on the wrong side of the war, right?
Yeah.
That if he is speaking from pure old Manetheren blood, the ancient lines, he should be an ally of the Aes Sedai, but he speaks of them with great suspicion, and so it appears that he's either somebody who was not Manetheren or was disloyal in some way, right? And I think that bit of intrigue is really great, but also, like, how the heck do you figure this out, because it's all thousands of years ago. So it's both like saying we're gonna unravel this, but also in a way that you're like, how do we figure this out? Is there gonna be like a series of hypnosis events or something as a part of that?
First off, this is a book where we've had like 18 dream chapters. Don't rule out the hypnosis plot line. That is definitely possible. I think for me, what's interesting about this is kind of the intersection between the 2 forces in Mat, because you're right to identify that kind of this Manetheren, like the descendants that Mat actually has should be allies of the Aes Sedai. But then the other force operating inside of him is the taint of Shadar Logoth, which is a place that basically tore itself to pieces due to its hate of Aes Sedai. And so this, I think, is the interesting question. Is this kind of the last vestige of the taint of Shadar Logoth that leaves him as this healing is done? Is this a sign that there is still something tainted in terms of his link to Shadar Logoth? Or, as you're saying, is it possible that even without any of that link to Shadar Logoth, Mat's kind of link to the old blood is too, as you say, someone traitorous or someone who doesn't have the well-being of at least the Aes Sedai in their forefront in the way that someone from Manetheren traditionally would. So I think this is kind of setting up an interesting mystery, but as you say, I have absolutely no idea what clues you get in a 2,000-year-old mystery.
Yeah, and I mean, what have we learned from Robert Jordan except that this is something we should trust him on? Like,
Yeah.
he wouldn't introduce something unless he had a way to do it and had a way to develop it and pull us along. While some of the mysteries have red herrings, there's no red herring mysteries. We'll pretend that works.
Sure.
Where something that's introduced that goes nowhere or gets abandoned, or
yeah.
I don't think we've seen one of those yet. But you know, I mean, back to your point, I do think Mat was the least involved of the five, and the TV show kind of demonstrated that as well.
Yeah.
And so now it's time to kind of have something fresh and new for him to do. And he's even kind of more thin here than the version of him we see on the television show, who was given a bit more backstory, which was a nice addition. So okay, now it's just deep backstory, as the case were.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of all we have to say about Mat, in part because we have 2 more Mat chapters coming, so we need to leave a little bit for later. The other side of the chapter healing that I think is interesting is we get just a little bit of a glimpse into the Aes Sedai, right? This is our first time that we see them actually using one of these massively powerful artifacts as opposed to just talking about them. This is the first time that we've seen Aes Sedai kind of working together to wield more of the power, seemingly, than they would have been able to on their own. And interestingly, it seems as if they are gathering the most powerful of the Aes Sedai in one room, right? They're talking about not knowing whether or not they have enough power. So I found kind of the fact that we were getting a lot of the characters that we already were familiar with, and then a few new names that immediately made me go like, okay, I should jot down these names. I should think about who they are. Anaya is mentioned. We have gotten a couple of vague references to her in the past, but the 2 actually new, like brand new names here are Seraphel and Alana. Neither of whom I think we've had mentioned before. It is worth noting, for those of you who have been watching the television show along with us, Alana is the Green Aja character who is a friend of Moraine's, but she has yet to appear in any serious way in the book. So I'm curious, of all of these things, whether it's new characters, new artifacts, new kind of techniques, was there anything on the kind of Aes Sedai side of things that stood out to you in this chapter?
This is going to be insulting, and I'll apologize in advance. It all kind of became noise at some point, and I don't like that, but I think where it comes from is that I'm so focused on the characters we know. I think this can happen in fantasy when you world build out your institutions. Like, I don't care what classes the Potter kids are taking, or we have a little free library out front, and one of those fantasy book series I've never read, the Patrick Rothfuss books, just appeared, and it was kind of a reminder of that there's a lot of kind of history of the academy and those books that you're like, it's not bad, and I certainly don't mean that, but I think in the drive to kind of say, like, I want to figure out what's happening with my characters, a lot of that kind of becomes noise. And so and maybe I'm just betraying my deep sexism, but it was like, okay, a bunch more women who are Aes Sedai, and again, looking a little bit at the TV show, thinking a little bit about where we've been in this book so far, I think it's clear there's more to be learned here, and particularly I'm thinking of like the way the Amerlin seat kind of mapped out the factions and the threat of the Black Aja. That's really exciting, and yet I have trouble getting excited about, like, here's 3 more women who will sometimes be in the hallways here, and then maybe the thing I will throw at Robert Jordan is we got to get significantly different names.
Yeah.
Right. The Elaine Egwene pairing, and here where we have, you just said Alana,
Yeah.
which sounds a lot like, not all that far from Leandrin in my head and things like that.
And
And so on.
Liana.
And Liana, yeah. So I think that's a little tricky for me.
Yeah.
I think I need something to prove they're more significant before and a separate name before I really kind of dig into them. But I really want to make sure that it's clear. I think that's a personal failing of mine. Like, I think this is good stuff and important stuff. I just had trouble finding purchase in it.
I want to give Min as a really good example of how Robert Jordan likes to introduce new characters, right? He gives them like a name drop in one chapter, and then they get a scene 5 chapters later, and then they get a POV a book later, and then they become a main character 2 books after that. And so I think all I'm doing right here is just like putting a pin on like, be aware these are names who might show up in a book and a half, right? Like no need to be keeping an encyclopedia of Aes Sedai at this point. But like, that's kind of where I'm at, is just like, these things are going to be thrown at you. And let's be real, there are going to be a bunch of important characters in this series. Let's just like start vaguely thinking their names every once in a while, and we'll get there eventually. I maybe promise it will not get better in terms of similar names. I'm so sorry. I have nothing else to say about the chapter Healing. It was 6 pages in my edition. It advanced the plot. That's kind of what it did for me. Any last thoughts here before we get on to Awakenings?
One other note that I don't think we've really hit on is you did mention that they're using a Sangreal, which is the middle tier, right?
It sort of, right? So remember, Terangriel don't modify your power, they do something else. And so Sangreal are the top of the 2 that are comparable to each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're on different scales, kind of, because they're different tasks. But alongside that, the way in which the power is described in that moment, just that it's really pulling at Egwene and Nynaeve felt significant to me. So that's kind of the last thing I had in my notes that we didn't talk too much about, is they are there as witnesses, kind of to help if needed, but they really feel that pull. And so my question was, is that just the power of the Sangreal and the power itself drawing everybody in? Or, we've seen pieces of kind of chosen one narratives for these 2 women. Is this something to do with that they are so powerful that the objects crave them as well?
That is a really fantastic point that is phrased as a question about the future, and therefore I can say nothing about it. Chapter 19, Awakening. Mat awakens. He feels as if he has some kind of holes in his recollections. He's not quite sure where he is and what was a dream or what wasn't. He thinks that Loyal must have been a dream because Ogier aren't real. He starts muttering something to himself in the old tongue, and then immediately has kind of a visceral memory of an ancient battle that's described over the course of a page or so. He is apparently a general. He is leading a battle against the Trollocs, and it seems to be a pivotal moment, and he says that he is a gambler and it's time to toss the dice. He kind of returns back to his own actual body, realizes he is in Tar Valon, and realizes he is feeling kind of weak. He tries to stand, finds an enormous tray of food, and starts eating all of it rapidly, very quickly. He kind of realizes that he must have been healed by the power. He doesn't like that idea and wishes he could have gotten out of it. And then there is a big old section where he reviews a lot of details that if you missed the last 2 books, it's important that you get them reviewed. He goes through the Aja and what Rand is up to and the fact that Aes Sedai can't lie and so on and so forth. Eventually, he thinks that he wishes he could have seen any other city other than a one full of Aes Sedai, and starts planning either his escape or his way to get somewhere else. He realizes abruptly that he has eaten all of the giant plate of food. He then finally remembers that he blew the horn of Valir, starts singing a song about being in trouble, resolves that he will just say that he's never seen the horn in his life, and then the door opens, which will of course lead us into the next chapter. Once again, 6 to 7 pages in my edition. Nothing really happens other than pushing that plot forward. What did you think about this one, which I think is most notable for being Mat Cauthon's first POV?
First POV in the series.
Correct.
Wow, excellent. Yeah, I mean, I have Matt exclamation point at the top. I've started to make sure in my notes I at least mark down whose POV we are at a given time. Um, this reminded me a lot of kind of an abandoned feeling I had at the end of the first book about Rand, that it
Mhm.
felt like when Rand returned from the climax, he was actually someone different. And while I'm not sure I'm fully able to like abandon that entirely, it certainly didn't become a factor immediately if that were the case.
Yeah.
And so this felt very much like, oh, did you think you were going to get to know Matt? Nope. He's now kind of half possessed by an ancient version of himself, seemingly. So, and this is the detail I almost ruined last chapter. I'm working real hard, single
Yeah,
chapter
it's a
listeners.
challenge.
But the fact, what was most compelling is this idea that he was a gambler. And I like the combination of he
Yeah.
was a leader and a gambler. I mean, when I think of cool World War II, World War One, any war movies, it's like that's the character I want to follow, right? The guy who takes the big swings, tries the crazy strategies, and is a gambler. Not actually who I'd want to follow in battle, to be
No.
clear, but that's an exciting character type. And again, okay, so now talking about what we were just talking about. Okay, so now maybe we will be able to learn more about this ancient mystery because he's going to have these kind of flash sideways. I don't know. It feels like that point in the Lost
Yeah.
episodes or something, where it's like, okay, these are things that happened. They're memories, but they're not really flashbacks because they're kind of from someone different. It makes me think of record skips because
Yeah.
we are, the wheel metaphor has been, really strong throughout. And it's like, oh, what happens if you skip a groove? Whereas the Rand interdimensional travel felt like separate records, but this feels like
Totally.
we're skipping in the same record.
Yeah, I will note here, I think that was a really good kind of call out of the fact that this idea of being a general and a gambler is a really kind of fascinating combination. I will note that kind of tied up in that gambler metaphor is the chapter icon of this chapter, which is 5 dice. We are not doing an ill advised visual media discussion of that because I want to wait for it a little bit. We will be talking about ill advised discussion of the next chapter icon, which Greg didn't know until right now, so he can prepare.
Just opening my book and trying to find things. Yeah, go ahead.
uh, the other thing that I really love about this sequence is that I like the idea that Matt is kind of finding these kind of ancient links to deep past or kind of an ancient version of himself at the same time that he is finding gaps in his own memory. And I think that just like at a almost like literary poetic level, I appreciate that. And I think it works really well as a framing for this chapter of what memories is he missing and what memories has he gained is kind of really interesting data. As you're saying, we don't quite know who this Mat Cauthon guy is, especially if things are getting mixed up in his head. And so that's the data that I found myself kind of really digging into is like, how similar is this past life to Matt and what does that mean about kind of what's missing and what it's been replaced by? I guess I'm just kind of restating your Lost story, but without referencing the show Lost. So I think I've made a better argument.
Oh, we're just losing all the lost heads. Are there any of those still? I mean, that's one of those shows that needs a better streaming deal, I think, to stay relevant.
That's
But
fair.
yes.
So if we are kind of thinking about that memory as kind of an interesting hint of things to come, we want to know more, but we don't have enough detail. The other kind of odd thing that happens in this chapter, a new detail about Matt, is boy, can he eat. And I don't know if we need to say anything else about that, but it takes up enough of this chapter that I just need to leave you room to comment on Matt being a hungry boy, I guess.
Yeah, kind of two feelings I had about that. First felt like we all get if we have like a stomach bug and you kind of come out of it and you're like, oh my God, I haven't had any calories in 3 days and it's time to eat as much as I can.
Yeah.
That came to mind. And, this is months long, if not a year long kind of shadow he's been under. So to come out and actually need calories makes sense in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it also just had a little tinge on it that felt a little kind of zombie like. I'm actually listening to a live play role playing podcast where they're doing like bugs that get inside humans, and it's
Mm,
like a zombie thing. And it was like all I could think about, because the voice of the bugs on the show is going feed, feed, feed. And so it
yeah.
felt a little bit like that. So for me, it felt like even money, that it's just kind of natural needing to catch up on lost time, and or it's supernatural and trouble is still ahead for Matt. This poor guy can't catch a break. Seems, I know you're famously a Perrin guy, and you've joked before that there are no Rand guys. So like, are there Matt people out there? Are you a Matt person as we listen, listeners?
I need to not say too much about this because obviously we have not gotten this character yet. But of the big five, if you will, I think there are probably the most Matt guys.
Oh, and you said guys, not people.
Also, probably accurate.
Okay, Ben Shapiro, thanks for calling in. Yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes, because it does feel like we haven't gotten to know Matt, and I'm repeating your point from last chapter, and so there's a lot more in play here. I won't spoil my note for the end of the next chapter, but it is related to the food.
Fair. Um, I think the only other thing that we get in this chapter that is worth comment on is Robert Jordan, I think, has finally reached the point where he is like, I am done overtly kind of minorly referencing all of the Aja and having you figure out whether you can count them. He just explicitly lists all seven in Matt's head for no reason other than to make sure readers have all seven Ajas in front of them. So it is worth taking the 30 seconds to review that, because it's information that Robert Jordan is done doing anything other than just expositioning and moving on. Red, they hunt down men who can channel. Blue, they have causes or are kind of spyish. Green, they go to war. They are the battle Aja. Yellow, heal things. Brown, our scholar. Yellow and white and gray. No one has told us anything about them yet. They're kind of the ones that don't matter. That is your lecture for the day. Anything to say about just the random pile of exposition we get? I felt like this was just clunky, is maybe why I'm bringing it up.
Well, I guess I have a note here that kind of the way you phrased all of that is kind of dispelling this, but it felt like this was information Matt shouldn't necessarily have.
That's fair, yeah.
So in this question of like who's driving the Matt car, I was like, this feels like this is the gambler, the member of the Heart Guard, like it's that guy who has this information. And I think feeling that unsettling way Matt is kind of slipping between the two actually is effective, as the characters can use the knowledge together, right?
Yeah.
And the only other thing in my notes we haven't gestured at, which is not that important, is just that like he's immediately worried about the horn.
Yeah.
That seems to merge the distrust of old Manetheren Matt and current Matt, that he knows he blew the horn, he knows that gives him a sense of power, but he deeply distrusts what the Aes Sedai are doing with that. So it seems to me how I read all of that is just this character is unsettled, but that doesn't necessarily work to his disadvantage. It's Slaughterhouse 5, the character is unstuck in time, right? That's kind of how he feels at this moment.
I think that is a really great comparison that I can say nothing else about. Before we get into chapter 20, Visitations, I think it's time that we do just a little bit of ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, talking about the chapter icon on chapter 20, which is a moon with 5 stars on a black background. And I will say, I want to hear your thoughts on the image. I want to hear your breakdown. And I will say, if you figured out what this was, it is possible from the text of the book, but it's a pretty obscure deep cut. So I want to hear what you think this might symbolize before I tell you.
Obviously, what stands out most is the 5 stars, right? And the fact that we have these 5 characters we've been tracing their journeys of, that stood out. Just in terms of composition, because this is usually something we talk about, black dominates, right? It's kind of a black field that the white stars and moon are set upon with kind of thick outlines that break the frame. But to me, that means, light in the darkness or a hope in a dark space or something along those lines.
Yeah.
The only other thing I'll say is there's a part of me, and I'm not a graphic designer, but I really wanted the 5 stars to complete the circle perfectly.
Yeah.
And they're kind of frustratingly not, which to my eye almost gives the moon like a sense of momentum, like the moon's pulling away or something like that. I'm not going to ascribe that intention to the artist, but it is kind of unsettling that it isn't a perfect circle or there's not a harmony to it. It's off.
Do you have any idea what this might symbolize at the beginning of a chapter? You see this and you are about to read about.
Not really. I mean, Tyler's picking on me because I said I read these a week ago before my vacation. And I'm like, I don't even remember what was in this chapter. I know we have a visit from an old friend, Celine. And so kind of whenever there's a new icon, I tend to think like, oh, this is what's going to represent her. Now, I'm stepping all over your summary. She also identifies that she is not a dark friend. She is other.
Yeah.
And so could this be the other symbol?
You are actually being too general. This is just the Celine / Lanfear symbol.
Okay.
If you will recall, this is a pretty deep cut. In the previous book, Rand gets into a little bit of a thing where he is throwing away letters with a bunch of different emblems and stamps on them when he is in Carrion. The letters that he receives from Celine have this symbol as the thing that is stamped into the wax on her letters. It's a moon and 5 stars. So I have no idea what that symbolizes, or all of the great things that you said about the circle are 100% correct. I was thinking about how like the white bars really kind of cause it to look really chaotic, where there's a little bit of a line or a kind of frame break, as opposed to it just being like black with white breaking out of the lines in a couple of places. But it's Lanfear, so dark, ominous, not fitting quite correctly, a little bit chaotic, mostly black with a tiny bit of light somehow in there. That all feels pretty Celine as we have seen her so far. Now that you know what this is about, any last thoughts on the symbol before we dive into the chapter?
I like your point about the white bars, because there is something there where it is breaking that frame, but the complete frame actually contains it. And so I think that's an interesting choice in terms of what we've seen in terms of chapter icons, that it is breaking the rules, but it is still somehow contained. And the way white and black are there, she breaks the rules of the light, but the dark still contains her, kind of feels possible.
That is so smart in ways that we can talk about in like 11 books. Like we'll get there. Right.
Clearing my 2029. Got it.
Chapter 20, Visitations. A beautiful woman enters the room. She comments on Mat's nakedness. He thinks Rand would know what to do and then covers up. She says she was in the White Tower for another reason and wanted to see him while she was there. She introduces herself as Celine, and he notes that she isn't an Aes Sedai. She's not wearing a ring, and she says that she is definitely not an Aes Sedai. She insists that she is not a novice, which is what Mat asks her. And then she says that their interests overlap, Mat and hers. She says he already wants glory, and Mat tries to insist that he's kind of unimportant and doesn't matter, but she says he is more important than any Aes Sedai. She denies being a dark friend or following Baal-Zaman. She says that there is one man she could stand beside, but she will never follow anyone. She says she's going to use Mat, but not the way the Aes Sedai will, and she at least will give him what he wants. She says his father was here and that the Aes Sedai are going to lie to him and not tell him that he was here. And then she starts listing some other details that kind of suggest that the Aes Sedai are kind of tricking him or trying to lie to him. He kind of realizes that he's going to seem crazy if he tries to tell the Aes Sedai that Celine was here. And just as he does, Celine hears something in the hallway and runs away. Mat decides that he needs to get out of here. He starts trying to gather up his boots. He gathers his dice, thinking that that is all he needs to be able to make enough money to feed himself and get out of town. As he starts to kind of gather things up, the a Merlin seat and the Keeper of Chronicles enter the room. She says that she knows Mat plans to run, but he can't because he's going to need to eat 3 to 4 more giant meals, and he's not allowed to leave the city, and there's no way he'll be able to afford to feed himself that much. She initially does not tell Mat about his father being there, even after he kind of prompts her, but eventually he kind of reveals that he knows. She acknowledges it, and then gives actually quite a few of the details that Celine said that she would not, but does hold back on a few things that Celine predicted she would. Suan asks Mat about the horn and suggests that not only is Mat the one who blew the horn the first time, but he is now linked to the horn, and so it's possible that dark friends will be coming after him. And she reveals in particular the fact that if Mat were to die, even dark friends could use the horn to benefit them. And so she kind of thinks he's going to be a target and suggests that he should stay in Tar Valon for a long time. Mat insists he's not a hero. He shouldn't have anything to do with this. And then basically she seems to threaten him and says, if you go anywhere else, you will be killed. The dark friends are after you. And then she kind of ominously leaves him to puzzle over the trouble. And he is so distracted by what is going wrong in his life that he doesn't eat a pie. And I am a man who loves pie, so that is the worst part of this entire chapter. That's more like it in terms of me summarizing a chapter. That felt like it took an appropriately long amount of time. What did you think about this chapter where we get Mat interacting with 2 exceptionally powerful women? Wasted pie is on his notes. I love it.
Last note in my chapter, which I alluded to last, it was he wasted pie, and that's unforgivable. Hey, yes, I completely agree. I mean, this easily wins the night. I don't even think it was a competition, and there's a lot here to chew into. But I want to just kind of take the global level and say, wow, what a fun read, where you get this setup of look how controlled you are and look how awful they are, and they're going to lie. And, here are all the things they're going to do to lie and hide the truth from you. And then the second half completely inverts that, and they share, in my notes I said they seem truthful if limited, right? But it does feel like if Celine was setting up this trap for the Aes Sedai completely escaped the trap. That doesn't mean they're innocent, that doesn't mean they're a force for good, but it means they escaped the trap. So that is a really neat bit of writing, and to take your expectations in that way I thought was really fun and made this stand out.
Yeah, and I think what really works in this chapter is the way that we get kind of 2 women interacting with Mat primarily, right? We get Suan and we get what I'm going to call Celine, even though, we've kind of been dancing between Celine and Lanfear for her. And those 2 characters, I think, really work in this section because, as we've kind of seen before, Suan feels like the more kind of scary one of those 2, right? While Celine, we have obvious reasons to doubt her and be fearful of her intentions, Suan is the aggressive one. She's the one who is going to withhold information until she thinks she can get an advantage from it. And so what really I think works, as you're identifying, is not just setting up the game and then having it feel like Suan kind of dances her way out of it effectively, but I think it works even on a reread because Celine is setting up a trap that most Aes Sedai probably would have fallen into. And so I think that tension of not only is it kind of a fun dance to watch, but it's a really smart trap in the first place is kind of rewarding in multiple ways.
The internet meme it reminds me of / just great moment from a television show is Lucille Bluth saying, look at me I'm getting off on withholding from you, which is this inversion of a trap one of the other kids set for her, because it has that same kind of attitude. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna just do whatever the heck I want, and that's me, you got me. Nope, not really. So that's the tone I read into that. And I just want to also acknowledge, because again, I accidentally queued up my television episode wrong. We are starting to see hints of Celine / Lanfear coming out on the show in some of the trailers that have been there. Mm-hmm. And I just want to note that her presence in that second book was so strong to me that I got excited seeing that trailer and thinking like, oh, good, I want to advance that. And, again, if you're not a show watcher, just know the show is like honors the spirit of these books, but remixes a lot. And I was like, oh, maybe we'll get a little more Celine hint before we actually get to where we are. So along those lines, you directly quoted the thing I wrote down about her, which is there is one man I could stand beside, but I wouldn't follow anyone.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting because mentally I had just chalked her up as a dark friend or like one of those top lieutenants of Baal-Zaman. And when she says what she says, I'm not sure that's about Baal-Zaman. I think that sounds more like Rand to me. And that's really interesting to think, well, what then is this character's goals? She's not going to follow, but is she, stand beside kind of naturally sounds like king and queen to me. And she's always described as beautiful and seems seductive. We start with a nude scene here. So I feel like there's a little bit of that. Does she just want to be the Lady Macbeth here? That's a Shakespeare reference. Look at that. Not just Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings.
Someone's got an English degree.
So it feels a little like that. And I'm very curious then there. And I think that folds into I'm here for some other reason. Like I'm just here for it by accident. Is that connected to the attempted assassination? Is that thing I'm forgetting, the assassin?
The gray man is the one that immediately jumped to my mind.
Yeah. So is she connected to those plots that we've just seen unfold a little last week or the week before? Or is it something even bigger and darker? Is she here to finish what the Black Aja couldn't? But all of that, and I'm just rambling at this point, but all of that's like, not only is this is it possible for a gray man to sneak in, but seemingly a huge agent of chaos is just chilling, just moving around, doing whatever she wants. This tower has some problems.
Yeah, and there was one moment in kind of that discussion that really stood out to me, and it's kind of right before she gives the line that you were describing, kind of being willing to stand beside someone but not behind anyone. But she kind of drops a line where she says, I'm going to use you, but not the way the Aes Sedai will, and not the way he will. And I think the easy reading of he is Baal-Zaman. But the way that both, I think she and Mat, there's like italics or emphasis or a question mark, something on both of them when they say the word he. I think there's a really interesting twist of like, is she talking about Baal-Zaman? Is she talking potentially about Rand using Mat? Is she talking about someone else? And so that is what stood out to me along with those two things you're talking about, right? I think her motivations are starting to become a little more clear. And just the fact that, as you say, like agent of chaos is, I think, the perfect term for where she is. She's now popped into all three of the boys' plot lines at one point or another. So she's clearly playing big games, not little ones. I think at this point, oh, go ahead, please.
Back to the fact that she's not from this dimension. So all that you just said, plus she is the Lanfear from another dimension, which is crazy and feels like something we kind of forget in the mix of these kind of supernatural forces. My comment about stacked records aside, because we kind of hadn't thought about that a lot in recent wanderings. So I don't know. That's crazy. And it brings to mind like the Joker from the Batman movies. Like, when done well, it's like, I just want to watch the world burn. And it feels like that's a little more of her energy.
And this is one of my favorite things that Robert Jordan does in general. I feel like if we're thinking about kind of the evolution of fantasy, where like on one end is like the J.R.R. Tolkien, there is a great king who will rise again, and there is a great evil who he must fight. And then, we think on the other end is like George R.R. Martin, where it's like everyone's terrible and everyone is trying to kill everyone all the time. Robert Jordan is a really interesting middle point in that, where he's like, there is good, there is evil, but evil isn't monolithic. There's Baal-Zaman and Selene and Padden Fane and Shadar Logoth and the White Cloaks, and he just keeps layering things on top of each other. And that's just where I get excited in these books is at some point we're in book 3 and I'm already being like, how is he going to resolve all of this? And you know it's going to keep getting more complicated, not simpler as this goes on. So I just think this is a really kind of fun place to be of like, okay, let's now start seeing how high we can stack these things before things start to fall apart. I don't have anything else to say about Celine at this point. So jump over to Suwon. Anything that immediately struck you as interesting about her half of this chapter?
I'm over the fish talk.
Yeah.
Again, we stay apolitical on this, but I always hated the Sarah Palin. I'm gonna be folksy for you, everybody. I'm just
Mhm.
folksy. You can't blame me for anything I do. I'm just folksy, and that's what I'm starting to feel from the
Yep.
Amaryllis Sea, excuse me. Is just that this is like a put on, right?
Yeah.
There's a in Glass Onion, people who misunderstood that fine piece of cinema misunderstood that Benoit Blanc feels like a caricature for the first half, and that's him doing that on
Yep.
purpose to disarm the other characters in the mystery. And I feel like that's what's happening with the Amerlin Sea is like, I'm going to
Yep.
ham up the folksy fish talk, and that way people won't see what the other hand is doing.
Yeah.
But it's like really like again with this, so it's already grating on me.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I appreciate about Suwon is that she is a character who her method of persuasion is I am going to tell you what I want. I am going to tell you why it's better than the other options. So do it. And that's kind of how my brain works. And so if you need to bury that in a bunch of fish metaphors, I'm willing to go with the fish metaphors with you. Like, give me a direct communicator any day of the week. You are someone who is in one of my Dungeons and Dragons group. So I'm going to say something that might be deeply offensive to the core of you. The thing that hurts me the most in Dungeons and Dragons of anything is when I am DMing and we're like working on something really big, and then out of nowhere a character like reverts to like the default thing they were at level 1, right? Like they're like, oh, I was this farmer who did this folksy whatever, and they just become that in the middle of an important moment, right? That destroys me every time. And that is exactly what Suwon is doing here, right? She's like, I have this really direct, awesome, nope, I'm going to do the silly thing now.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like sometimes that's great, but it's not a joke here. And so
No.
it doesn't work.
Um, and if it's even more confusing to me in some ways because it's like nobody else but us knows about the
Yeah.
like fish backstory. What I said before, where she's using it to disarm people, like it can't be effective. Like that might still be the character's motivation, but
Yeah.
like Matt doesn't know she comes from fish people,
Yeah.
not literal fish people, but fishing people. Um, and so like, how is that going to operate here?
Yeah.
I will then say that the rest of the scene I really enjoyed kind of playing out. Watching the fact that I said I can't lie and trying to find
Yeah.
that border of where is she telling the truth, but committing what is generally called a lie of omission, right?
Mhm.
Although that it wouldn't be a lie under I said I rules. And it's like, okay, she's being very careful in these few places. And I think that I'm sure on a reread is kind of delicious to track.
Well, I think the thing that Suwon does so well in this sequence in it's a strategy that we all need to start adopting is whenever someone asks her a question that she doesn't want to answer, she just gives more detail to the answer of the previous question so it still sounds like she's being helpful. Right? Like Matt asks her, was my dad here? She's like, oh yeah, he was, whatever. And then he asks a really like direct question about like, what are you going to do with me? And she says, oh, your dad was asking about this. He was doing that. And like, that feels like just such an Aes Sedai thing. And it's something I've actually picked up on Moraine doing 3 or 4 times and hadn't been able to say it in the first book when she did it. So I'm so glad you're catching this now instead of me biting my tongue about it. It's great.
I mean, doesn't that sound like every academic conference you've ever been to, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I couldn't answer the question that was asked, so I'll just fill in the detail from my talk and regurgitate it, usually long enough to think of an okay response. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's an old academic trick to just fill in talk rambles from what you know and avoid the actual question until you're ready.
Which honestly is possibly another hypothesis about fish ramble, right? Like if every time
Yeah.
someone asks you something and you don't have your best answer ready, like tell them a story about Silverpike and you'll probably have a good answer to their question by the time you're done.
You're telling me to do that in class? Like
all the
that's my
time.
fall
Just silver
persona
pike,
now.
nothing
Yeah.
else.
On to fish talk, everybody.
So
I'm picturing a first year like checking the syllabus. Like, did I sign up for the fish section of college writing?
I was
Yeah.
just about to drop a Charlie Moore outdoors joke, and then I realized no one outside of like a very small area of Boston will know what the hell I'm talking about.
Yeah, true, but I appreciate the reference. There's not a lot else here I have. Clearly felt like both women were manipulating Matt. And,
Yeah,
manipulate doesn't always have a negative connotation, right?
right.
Getting somebody to logically reach the conclusion you want them to isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
But it did feel like this is a puppy being called by two owners, right?
Yeah,
Like, do you want to live with mom or dad after the divorce or something along those
yeah,
lines? And at the heart of that is the Matt we figured out from the last chapter is not all that like okay. So
yeah.
what do you do when you mix those two elements? That seems like a pause so everybody gets their bingo cards out, a powder keg.
I, I think for me, what is so fascinating about this chapter is that it's two people manipulating Matt by telling him that they are going to manipulate him. And so what he's left with is no longer like which one of them is telling the truth, because I think they both are. And so it's really interesting to see him, as you say, he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the first impression of Mat Cauthon that we get in basically 3 books is of him being like, this sounds like a bad thing. I'm going to run away now. And that's a character I can get behind, honestly. Any last thoughts on Mat Cauthon's dilemma before we wrap up this episode of Through the Glass Columns?
I'm just going to say Matt was more compelling here than he has been in a while. I look forward to the next Matt chapter, whenever that may be. Again, my experience of the Game of Thrones books is you get to the end of an Arya chapter and you're like, damn it, why are we going to Sansa? And then you get to the end of the Sansa chapter and you're really mad the next one's Arya because you're like, oh, I wanted the rest of that plot. So I think I was feeling that a little bit here. Like I hadn't been craving a Matt chapter, but it was fun being with him for a while and advancing this. That being said, there's a lot of balls in the air.
Yeah.
I haven't previewed what our next 2 chapters, what the POVs are, but it's like there are a lot of plot lines that are geared up now, and I think they're going to start moving at a pretty good clip soon. So tell us what to read for next week and then close out the show, Tyler.
Well, you started a sentence just a moment ago by saying, you get really excited to read such and such chapter. You are probably not going to be excited to read the first of our 2 chapters next week. Next week, we will be reading chapter 21, A World of Dreams, which is a world of Greg's nightmares, and chapter 22, The Price of the Ring. 2 quick kind of previews as we get into this. Number 1 is that we are going to be seeing a second version of a scene that we have seen in a previous book, which is a very kind of interesting thing to do. The other is that if you have been following along with us watching the television show, the conclusion of season 1 features a very interesting sequence, which we will be getting the original version from the book next week through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.